This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, my guest is Howard Bloom, and we'll be talking about his latest book called The Muhammad Code. The conversation will begin in a moment. Howard Bloom is my guest. He's been on a few times before. This time he is here to talk about his latest book called The Muhammad Code. It's basically his thesis about Islam, its creation, its perdurance, and its state today. And so let me just give Howard a few minutes to sort of just state out what his thesis is about Islam and the world in general.
Well, we've got a strange world right now. We seem to be in a part or in the middle of a temporary battle with militant Islam, with jihadist Islam. In fact, we're told it's not even with Islam, that it's just some death cult, that it's just some peculiar kind of extremism that you can see among Christians, that you can see among Jews. It's not unique to Islam, and that Islam is a peaceful religion. But in fact, righteousness, holiness, and purity in Islam is based on following the example of Muhammad. It's based on following his life, step by step by step in your own life. And the fact is that Muhammad had two phases of his life. In one phase of his life, when he was living in his hometown of Mecca, he was peaceful and he preached peace. There was a bit of violence that his group instigated, but it was very small. Then he moved to another town, Yathrib. We know it better today as Medina. In that town, he became a prophet unlike any other prophet we've ever seen on the face of the earth. Moses never only picked up a weapon, I believe, once and only killed one human in his life. Never led a military campaign. Jesus would have loathed a military campaign. Buddha would have loathed a military campaign. But Muhammad commanded 65 military campaigns, personally led 27 of them, went into battle with 2 coats of chainmail, with a bulging arrow case, broke his bow in battle. He was so vigorously trying to shoot down the enemy, and he entered with a sword. These other prophets loathed killing. Muhammad loved killing. Muhammad told his people that killing an enemy of Allah is the default mode. And what's an enemy of Allah? An enemy of Allah is anybody who criticized Muhammad. So Muhammad left us with an example of government. He set up a government in the town of Medina. He set up a set of laws. That's what we know today as Sharia. He set up a military system. He set up a bunch of military standards with lines like, you should not take prisoners among the enemy until you have made great slaughter in the land. Until you have thoroughly subdued the land via slaughter. And no other prophet has done that. We're not supposed to know any of these aspects of Muhammad's life, but during those 8 years of nonstop war, he conquered 317 square miles of territory a day, which is why Osama bin Laden called him Muhammad the Conqueror. Not Muhammad, a man of peace. That the prophet of peace is not a phrase that appears in the original Islam literature in the holy books of Islam. Muhammad called himself the prophet of war.
Well, let's talk about the book itself, because the book makes a lot of claims, and I know, just having looked upon excuse me, Amazon and some other sites, there have been, I guess, predictable criticisms. One of the books that I would compare this to, and I'll do a little bit later, is with Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, because the book seems to me, and I'm by no means an expert in Islamic history, but it seems to me more definitely a polemical work and a work of agitprop rather than history. You're trying to convince your readers of points A, B, and C rather than sort of just give sort of an objective distance nuance. Is that correct in my
No, I think it's utterly and completely wrong. This is the story of Muhammad's life that school children are taught. You're not supposed to know it. I'm not supposed to know it, but it is the story of Muhammad's life. And it is not agitprop. It is extraordinarily heavily researched, and it's sourced from the primary Muslim sources, the Quran, the Hadith, Ibn Ishaq, and Al-Tabari. Those are the main sources, plus a lot of more contemporary Muslim scholars. So the story of Muhammad's life that is told in this book, you can find it in in all kinds of biographies of Muhammad written by Muslims for other Muslims. You just won't find it in books written for you and me.
Well, before I ask some specific questions, do you view Islam the way, say, the world viewed the Nazis in the 1930s or the Soviets in the 1950s? Because there seems to me just a chasm of difference in the ability for Muslim terrorists to inflict damage. I mean, when we were talking about the Nazis, they were at the time in the late 1930s during Hitler's buildup the most technologically advanced war machine basically the world had ever known. And the Soviets just a few years later were not as technically advanced, but they were the largest army, the Red Army, the largest, most efficient army probably that the world had ever seen. Whereas when we look at modern terrorism, certainly if we just want to stick from post 9/11, we're talking about ragtag bands that ebb and flow, that oftentimes hate each other. This isn't a monolith. It seems to me that the idea in the book is that there's a Muslim monolith out there, and that just doesn't seem to cohere with the world as we know it.
Well, the monoliths out there that we have to worry about are China and Russia. And in terms of ultimate killing capacity at the moment, jihadism, militant Islam, doesn't come anywhere near their killing capacity, though the jihadists are trying to get their hands on nuclear weapons, and if that happens, everything will change. And there are 120 nuclear weapons in the hands of Pakistan. Pakistan has manufactured those, continues manufacturing nuclear weapons, and Pakistan is in danger of falling into the hands of its jihadists, of its extremists. But there's an aspect to militant Islam that you have to know about, and it is that even though at the moment Russia and China present a far greater danger to the United States than militant Islam is actually killing Americans, killing Westerners. China is not doing that. Russia is not doing that. But there's a grand goal behind what the jihadists are doing. It's a goal that was set by Muhammad in 629 AD. In 629 AD, Muhammad sat down and wrote after years of nonstop war, after years of killing, after years of what Muhammad himself considered to be genocide, killing everybody in a trap. After years of this, Muhammad sat down and wrote his letters to the emperors. He chose the 6 biggest emperors that he knew of in the world. It was every major emperor of his time, with the exclusion of the emperor of China. And he sent them invitations to Islam. He invited them to his religion. But he said that if they didn't accept his invitation, he would be forced to use other means, which he had inculcated into Islam by that time. The idea that if you rejected the invitation to Islam, it was death for you. It was death. And these 6 emperors, only one, there's a story about one, again, in the Islamic literature. It is Hercules, the head of the Byzantine Empire. And he turned to his advisors and he said, "Who is this letter from?" And they said, "Oh, Your Majesty, it's a letter from a people of sheep and camels. You'll never hear of them again. Ignore the letter." Well, that was very bad advice, because within less than 100 years of Muhammad's death, his followers had followed his implication in his letters to the emperor. He said God had taken the ends of the earth for him and had drawn those ends together that he could see the furthest reaches of the earth. And God had given him the entire earth. This is what Muhammad said. So he laid out a goal of global conquest. And he also laid out a plan. He basically said, from now on, it's the Muslims versus everybody else. And there will be war until the day of judgment, as the Muslims try to take what God himself has given to them, the entire globe. So his troops set out to conquer the entire globe, and they did something that had never been done in history before and has never been done since. They conquered a territory 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. That is the size of 5 Roman empires, and 7 times the size of the United States. But it was all just a step on a path toward conquering the entire globe. So Islam has been in a world war since 629 AD, when Muhammad sent out his letters to the emperors. What you and I are experiencing, what we're experiencing in Orlando, what we're experiencing in San Bernardino, what we experienced in Berlin last week, what we experienced in the Paris massacre, these are all just battles in a nearly 1,400-year-long battle of Islam to take what God told it is its due, the world.
Well, Howard, 1,400 years and they haven't succeeded. That would seem to be one of the most incredible streaks of futility and failure in world history in any way you look at it. I mean, it makes the Chicago Cubs look like perennial winners.
Not exactly. First of all, again, even the Romans succeeded in only taking a fifth of what Islam took. And one thing that you're taught in Islam is patience. You're taught patience, and you're taught that the more trials you are put through in your life, the greater the victory. That you must make your way through every trial, through every torment, through every frustration, and eventually you will win. And this kind of thing has proven, God has proven to be right, if you believe in a God. I don't. But he promised, for example, the city of Byzantium, the new Rome that Constantine, the emperor, established in order to move the capital of Rome from the Italian peninsula east. They were told they would capture the new Rome, and God proved right. Just it was a matter of patience. It took 700 years. It took from 629 AD until 1453 for the Muslims to conquer it, and yet they did. And the predictions from the holy books also say that Islam will take Rome. Rome means the whole Western world, means all of Europe, it means the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. It means, presumably, it means America too. Well, it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of patience. After all, God has delivered over and over again in the past. He delivered the Persian Empire within 6 years of Muhammad's death. One of the two massive superpowers, unbeatable superpowers at the time. And this tribe of camels and donkeys toppled it and took it over within 6 years of Muhammad's death. It's been a track record of the most astonishing imperialist and colonial success the world has ever seen.
Well, let me before I ask you about that, I wanted to get back to the idea of different types of Islam because you mentioned in the book, I think it's around page 255, talking about, or 253, talking about Algeria to Indonesia, and if you look at the different countries that currently are practicing Islam, there's quite a wide range. There are more advanced and more regimented parliamentary secular places like Turkey and Indonesia. There are the ISIS and the fanatical little regimes that have popped up every so often. There have been Islamic countries that have tried to modernize, like Egypt under Nasser. So, I mean, there are. It's not like it's all one. I mean, we know the Sunni Shia split. You have Wahhabism. You have Sufi. You mentioned, and a handful of other little offshoots. Not all of these branches are girding for war. It seems like a very thin slices. If you cut the earth in half, it's like the outlier crust are these radicals. Most of the people at the core are basically is Muslim Homer Simpsons that just want to get along and tend to their land or send their kids to college and become a lawyer or a doctor. It seems.
Well, it's very hard to know. I have a lot of friends in the Muslim community, and the sheikh who runs Dubai and made Dubai what it is today named a racehorse after one of my books, the 11th President of India, Dr. APJ Kalam, who was a Muslim, called my work a visionary creation. My biggest fan, splits his time between Islamabad and Pakistan and Dubai. The former Minister of Development for Dubai went in front of the Arabian Business and Economic Forum and said, there is a book that I particularly resonate with, he said, and it contains the future of Dubai, and then he proceeded to read passages from one of my books. So I have close connections in the Muslim world, and my friends appear to me to be moderate, pluralists, tolerant, and some of those wonderful, creative people on the face of planet Earth. I adore them. And to the best of my knowledge, there is no way that I identify with jihadist Islam. No way at all. Then there are people like Asr Nomani, and who was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for 11 years, and like Ayan Hirsi Ali, who's, I believe, at Harvard now. And these two women are calling for a Muslim reformation, for the same kind of reformation within Islam that Christianity had in 1517 when Martin Luther went to the doors of the Church of Wittenberg and nailed his 95 Theses to the door. But they are being hounded. These two women, and they have a whole list in Ayan Hirsi Ali's latest book. She has a list of about 50 people.
And certainly, like Salman Rushdie, most famously,
right, about 50 people that she regards as other supporters of a Muslim reformation. But these two women are being hounded by the Council for American-Islamic Relations. When Ayan Hirsi Ali got a phone call from the president of Brandeis University saying that he wanted to give her an honorary degree in social justice, which she has more than earned. She came out of a Somali family. She was raised to fear the fire of hell, the Muslim fire of hell. She became a Muslim Brotherhood member when she was 11 or 12 years old. She slowly morphed into a jihadist, that is, a jihad enthusiast, when she was about 16. And then she put herself, her father married her off to a Canadian. She was put on a plane to Canada. The plane had a stop in Germany. She got off the plane in Germany. She never got back on again. She put herself through university in Europe. This girl who came from a primitive, extremely ferocious Muslim background, and she became a member of parliament in Holland. Then she made a film. She was horrified by the plight of women in Islam. Honor killings are all too common, and the Quranic scholars give you precise instructions on how to beat your wife. She was disturbed by all of this. She made a film about the plight of women under Islam. She made it with a filmmaker who was a great-great-grandson of Vincent van Gogh's brother, Theo van Gogh. Well, because of this film, one day, Theo van Gogh was bicycling down the streets of Amsterdam, and he was attacked by a Muslim who had been born in Holland, who was living on welfare in Holland, and who stabbed him over and over again, unloaded a complete pistol into him, and then pinned a manifesto to his chest that said, "Oh, America, I know that you will fall. Oh, Holland, I know that you will fall. Oh, Europe, I know that you will fall," which are common lines in many of these jihadist manifestos that are pinned to bodies. So this is a woman who's been through a lot, and the president of Brandeis says he's going to give her an honorary degree in social justice. She's more than earned. 6 months later, she got another call from the president of the University of Brandeis saying that he had to withdraw his offer to give her an honorary degree. Why? The Council for American Islamic Relations and the Muslim Students Union, the Muslim Students Organization, MSI, Student Association, which is a group backed by Saudi Arabian funds and a group that has produced jihadists, its presidents and officers have become jihadists, like Ayman al-Zawahiri. They convinced the liberal intellectual elite, a group of which I'm sort of a part, at Brandeis, the faculty and the students, to sign a petition absolutely objecting to Ayan Hirsi Ali getting any kind of degree whatsoever from Brandeis or any kind of recognition on the basis of the idea that Ayan Ali Hirsi, who wants a reformation within Islam that moves it away from jihadism, that she is Islamophobic. That's outrageous. And
well,
so
yeah,
he was withdrawing the offer.
Without a doubt. I mean, and one of the points your books make, and I think that's a really valid and good point, is that it seems to me that the intellectual West, mostly the left-wing liberals, are sort of recapitulating their 1930s and 1940s view of the Soviet Union, in that all is sunny and whatnot. Do you see that as a historical recurrence, that it's similar to the way left-wing people in the 30s and 40s looked at the Soviet Union before Stalinism's horrors became manifest?
Well, yes, I think that's a good observation. That's your original observation. I haven't heard that before, but again, it's denial of the obvious. And we certainly went through denial of the obvious with the Soviet Union, because there were groups of journalists sent on train journeys through the Soviet Union who saw the kulaks that Stalin was starving to death, sitting shivering at the airports, starving to death in front of their very eyes, and yet reported that there was a paradise in the Soviet Union. That's self-deception. And yes, another act of self-deception is being encouraged. The Islamophobia campaign comes from the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Now, that may sound like a small group to you and me, but it's the biggest non-governmental, it's the biggest multi-governmental group outside of the United Nations. It includes 57 countries that call themselves Islamic nations, most of which have a form of law in their law code. Sharia law is built into their laws. These countries have a lot of power. They have a lot of petrodollars. They support a head office to the tune of $15 million a year. But when that head office gets on a campaign, it can also draw on all the PR and lobbying might of the 57 Islamic nations. So that's a total combined clout of hundreds of millions of dollars a year worth of lobbying and PR power.
Well,
let me just finish.
Okay.
It's this group that has worked since the 1990s to make the idea of Islamophobia real and to give the impression that any criticism of Islam whatsoever is a form of madness, sickness, delusion, and bigotry, and even racism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I totally agree that, I mean, there's genuine what you could call Islamophobia, and then there's the hurling up. I mean, it's similar to people who would say that any criticism of Israel is somehow being anti-Semitic. I mean, you have to look things with a fine-tooth comb. Going back to Hirsch and Ali, though, the left here, and especially on college campuses of the last few years, has produced this college campus idea that there's a massive rape culture, especially in college and in America, and yet those same people will look at, as you mentioned, the way women in Islamic countries are being treated, where you could have a genuine claim of a rape culture, violence towards women far beyond anything experienced here in America or the West, and yet they are curiously silent about that as well. Is that also part of this sort of way of ignoring, same thing like I said about Stalinism being ignored because it was convenient for their political beliefs, do you think?
Well, yes, I think you're right about that. And you're right that there is an extraordinary rape culture that's a part of Islam. Remember, the 8th chapter of the Quran is about how to divide up the loot. What's loot? Well, you go into a town and kill all the men, and all the property then belongs to you. And where did you get it from? Well, it's Allah's gift. It's Allah's bounty. It's Allah's generosity toward you. But you don't just take the television sets. You don't just take the material goods. You don't just make off with the clothes. You take the women and female children as sex slaves. And how you divide those sex slaves up is right there in chapter 8 of the Quran. So there is a rape culture. You see it at work in Boko Haram, where they took 300 girls captive, but you haven't read about most of the girls that they've taken captive. Times 300 schoolgirls. You've seen it with the rape culture in ISIS, where they have one of the most sophisticated systems for selling sex slaves you've ever seen in your life. That's at the very beginning of the book. All this supported by the Quran. Well, you can say, but the Quran is an ancient document. The Bible also has slaves. The Bible also has handmaidens, sex slaves. So what's the difference? There's no difference between the Quran and the Bible. That's not true. The Bible was written during a most of it was originated probably around 600 BC, at a time when books with origin myths tended to be genocidal. The other origin myth books from the same period are the Vedas, which are genocidal, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are genocidal, and the Old Testament, my people's book, the Torah, is genocidal. Muhammad's Quran came along 1,200 years later, but more important, one of the key aspects to jihadist Islam, to extremist Islam, is that Muslims are told this: God sent his truth via anywhere from 25 to 2,500 prophets. Every one of them delivered the truth of God. In other words, delivered exactly what's in the Quran, word for word, punctuation mark for punctuation mark. And then the people to whom these truths of God were delivered mucked it up. They adapted the truths that they're given from God through a prophet. They changed it to fit their time. And in the process of changing it, they perverted it. They made it demonic. They made it satanic. The only people who have ever held true to God's word, the only people who have ever not changed a syllable, the only people who have looked backward steadily to the example that God laid out in humanity in Muhammad's life, which was as much a communication from God as was the Quran, were the Muslims. And the Muslims' obligation is to hold fast to that truth of Muhammad's life and the truths of the Quran. So whereas the rest of us have shed the baggage of our genocidal holy books, your obligation as a Muslim is to stay true to the genocidal heritage of your holy book.
Well, let me talk about the state of Iran, the modern state of Iran, founded by the Shah, since you mentioned that throughout the book here and there. It seems to me that most scholars would say that modern jihadist Islam of the post-World War era begins with the Iranian Revolution. But from everything that I've read and seen documentaries and read articles on, it seems to me that as the years go on, the fundamentalist leaders in Iran are getting further and further out of touch with the young people, and that it seems almost like Iran, if you want to call them the superpower of the Islamic world, that Iran is probably somewhere in the Brezhnev years of the Soviet Union, that within a generation or two, there's probably a good chance that there's going to be, some internal thing that basically modernism reasserts, because Iran was a country that prior to it, women didn't wear the veils. It was a modern, educated country. It wasn't a backwater. So talk to me your views of Iran, because you mentioned how they subverted and a lot of things, and they suckered Bush into the war, and I totally agree with that. We were played perfectly by them. But do you really think that 50 or 100 years from now they are going to still be like that? Because from what I've always read, they seem to be on shaky ground within their own nation, the fundamentalists.
Well, I agree with your analysis. The difficulty is that the Ayatollahs who run Iran, right down to the Ayatollah Khomeini, who founded the modern Iran in 1979, they've always been on shaky ground. And here's why. In 1979, when the revolution took place, the moderates, the pluralists, the tolerant people, the people that you and I would love and still would love today, the secular folks, they thought they had won the revolution. And then the Ayatollah, who had been in France, banished from his own country, flew back into Tehran and flooded the country before he ever came into town with the hot technology of the time, with his own lectures, his own speeches, his own sermons on audio tape. And audio tape was it when it came to media at the time. He built a groundswell of support, apparently primarily in the rural districts, and then by being more willing to use violence than anybody else, he took over the revolution that the seculars were certain they had won. And the seculars have remained a very important component, probably the majority component in Islam or in Iranian cities ever since. but they've been under the rule of the Ayatollahs. And who told the Ayatollahs that they should take over every political system they should possibly take over, and that they should kill everyone who opposed them? It was Muhammad, because that's how he set up a government, establishing a military dictatorship and then killing anybody who even seemed to be in opposition to him. When Muhammad took over Mecca, he took over Mecca through terror. He took over Mecca by going into a nearby Jewish village and beheading every single man old enough to have pubic hair, taking the women and children as sex slaves, and terrifying the heck out of the Meccans. So when Muhammad showed up at Mecca's gates, they bargained with him to not try to conquer them. They gave him the town if he would take it peacefully. Well, there were two slave girls, who were singing satirical verses about Muhammad. Which, if you're a slave girl and you want to sing about something, this is the headline issue of the day: Muhammad's takeover. Well, Muhammad had them killed. When one of them bolted, he had his brave knights on their war horses run her down and have her trampled to death. And then, just for good measure, Muhammad had the owner of the two girls killed. This was Muhammad's approach, and this is the approach the Ayatollahs took in Iran. They were literally taking school teachers out of their classrooms with the students watching, and taking the teachers into the courtyard and mowing them down with machine guns while the students watched. So it's very hard to tell how long this Iranian government will last. And one of the things, I wish I had my quotes in front of me so I could give them to you exactly, but one of the many, many, many things that the Ayatollah, who's George Washington of Iran, his words are the words people look up to today, said is that it will be that every non-believer is as impure as dogs and urine. Totally impure, filthy. That means you and me. And that it will be the duty of the Muslims to wage a holy war throughout the world in order to impose Islam on every nook, cranny, and scrap of this world. Where did he get that? He got that from Muhammad in 629 AD, and it is built into the Iranian constitution. That the job of Iran's army, its IRG, its Iranian Revolutionary Guard, is to take over the world on behalf of Islam. Well, and remember that the patience, this doesn't mean they're going to do it in 2 years. This means if it takes 100 years, do it step by step. And Iran is step by step building itself as the superpower in the Middle East, and then as a superpower on a part of European superpowers, and then it really looks forward to a confrontation with the United States.
Well, I mean, but what the leaders would think is often irrelevant to what happens in history. I mean, you even just admitted earlier that you agreed that Iran is probably going to be on shaky ground, because it seems to me the few Iranians I've met, maybe a half a dozen Iranians over my years, and just as I've met other people from other countries that would tell me things, especially in the Middle East, that the people who run Iran are probably as well regarded by your typical Iranian on the street as most Cubans felt about Fidel Castro, who recently died, that son of a bitch.
Good analogy.
Most Cubans I've known, if at least in Cuba would be that, oh yes, Fidel. They go home and they're like, that son of a bitch, I want him to die. And I've gotten the impression, maybe it's wrong, that most certainly college-age, educated Iranians, and even the working class Iranians out there, probably feel very similarly about Khomeini.
Well, I've been on, you probably know, I appear on Iranian TV and Saudi TV all the time. And my producers are absolutely lovely to me, both my Saudi producers and my Iranian producers. I adore them. But in one debate, I was told by a guy named, this is a debate on Iranian TV, I was told by a guy named Hussein Ibish, who is a Harvard graduate. I believe his father was also a Harvard graduate. And he presents himself on PBS and other major American outlets as the epitome of moderation, of Islamic moderation. I talked about my liberal Muslim friends, my moderate Muslim friends on Iranian TV Ibish turned to me and said, "Don't you ever use those words. Moderate Islam, liberal Islam." Again. Well, when the show was over, I sent him an email inviting him to get together for lunch so he could explain himself and I could explain myself and we could get to know each other a little better. I never got an answer. Never got an answer. Meanwhile, your brothers at Azam Publications, and there was an organization called Azam Publications, which was an Al-Qaeda support group in the West, in English, that signed off on 9/11, that disappeared from its website on 9/11. And they said, there is no such thing as a moderate Muslim. If there were a moderate Muslim, what would we call Muhammad? Would we call him a terrorist or extremist? After all, he killed 700 to 900 Jewish men in one town. So is he then a terrorist? The problem is I have friends who I know are moderate Muslims. I have friends who I know are liberal Muslims. I have friends who I know dare not lift their voices for fear of having their throats slit in their own community. And yet, there is this idea that every Muslim has to stay true to the example of Muhammad, including his warrior example. That's, I assume, what Hussein Ibish meant.
Let me go back to some talking points that are often used to explain the schism between the West and Islam. The two ones that come most to mind are oil and also colonialism. And you talk about how the slave trades, how Muslim Barbary Coast pirate types would capture some Europeans. They were also trading in slave with sub-Saharan Africa, just as the Europeans of that age were dealing in the Middle Passage stuff, and even black kingdoms had Arabs for slaves. While I think it's important to bring that out there, I don't think that really illuminates anything that we didn't really know. Maybe if you when you talk about the fellow who you referenced who said it was over 1 million Europeans, and there's some debate about actual numbers, but not that it really matters. That's a slave is a slave is a slave. Isn't that sort of like just I guess adding fuel to a fire? Because we know that in the ancient world, everyone had slaves pretty much if they could get away with it, if they had enough power. Might made right.
Well, we have a bunch of things we beat ourselves up for, including imperialism, colonialism, and slavery. If those are indeed bad things, and I do believe they are bad things, then surely we have to apply the principles of criticism of those three things wherever we find them. The biggest imperialist enterprise that has ever existed upon the face of planet Earth is the Muslim enterprise. Again, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire. It's so much bigger than the European colony or imperialism at its very height that it's ridiculous. When it comes to colonialism, you'll see in the holy literature the demand that entire Arab tribes leave their towns and spread out into the Islamic Empire. That's a holy deed. That's colonialism. When it comes to slavery, for every one, look, the European slave trade was monstrous. Over 1 million people died. That is a Holocaust. It's not 6 million, but it's an awful lot of people, and it's unacceptable, right? In the Muslim slave trade, which actually began, it was an Arab slave trade that began around 200 AD. It began 400 years before Muhammad ever came along. In that slave trade, for every one slave we took in Black Africa, the Arabs took 10. Our history with Africans was terrible. Of every 10 that we took, 1 died just in the process of passage, getting from Africa to North America or Europe. But in the Arab slave trade, 9 out of every 10 died. These people were taken in the dark interior of Africa. They were loaded up with ivory and gold, which were big export items from Africa, more than they could carry. And many, many, many of them died on the trek of hundreds of miles, carrying an overburden of cargo. ports like Mombasa. So if we are serious about opposing slavery, we have to know, and if we are serious in feeling that those who had slaves should feel a sense of guilt today, then we should be applying this to the Muslim world, not just to the Western world, because the Muslim world outdid us 10 to 1. And it horrifies me when I run into a black friend who has a Muslim name, because this is genuinely what Anna Freud called identification with the oppressor. These people do not realize the way that they were treated in the Muslim world.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I've often sort of scratched my head when a lot of sub-Saharan Africans will talk about Islam being a religion that's more friendly to them to Christianity. I think basically mostly all the religions from the West or from non-sub-Saharan Africa have basically done wrong there. Let me just, before I get back to those 2 points, since you mentioned it again, I want to just read the frontispiece, and I want to talk about it. The frontispiece of your book says, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and Adolf Hitler tried to take over the world. All of them failed. Yet an illiterate desert prophet and his followers hammered together an empire 11 times the size of the conquest of Alexander the Great, 5 times the size of the Roman Empire, 7 times the size of the United States, the biggest empire in history. How did Muhammad pull it off, and how does his success threaten you and me? Now, since those are the first words of the book, I have to, just as someone looking up, empire is defined as an extensive group of states or countries under a single supreme authority, especially an emperor or empress. And when you talk about the Islamic Empire, it just doesn't fit that definition. There have been Islamic empires, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Timurids, the Ottomans, and oftentimes these were separate states that warred almost genocidally against each other. The Battle of Ankara, I believe it was, the Timurids and the Ottomans fought, and even though they were all Muslims, they hated each other. By the definition that you use for empire there, could I then say that the 3 bloody, horrific wars that France and Germany fought from 1870 to 1945 was a Christian civil war? Because that's the same.
Absolutely. Not to mention the 100 Years' War, not to mention all the wars between Protestants and Catholics after Martin Luther. By the definition of empire that you just read, Europe never had an empire. The only country that had an empire, Holland had its empire, and Spain had its empire, Portugal had its empire, England had its empire, but because they were at each other's throats, there was no Christian empire, and no European empire. And yet, we talk about European imperialism all the time. These countries were at each other's throats for the 400 years or 500 years, during which each of them had its own individual empire. So there's no European imperialism. But that's not true. European imperialism did exist, despite the fact that the various European powers were at each other's throats. And Islamic imperialism has existed, despite the fact that there are factions within Islam that have been at each other's throats. And Carolyn Elkind is a historian at Harvard. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And she bills herself as the world's leading authority on the history of imperialism. And she says point blank, she said this on the Charlie Rose show, that no empire in the history of the world has ever conquered the hearts and minds of the people. It conquered, it took over. And it sounds to me as if Carolyn Elkind has never known about the history of the Muslim empire, because the countries that Islam has taken over through a combination of warfare, of bloody savagery, just like we use bloody savagery, unfortunately, in our imperialist conquests, and the sweetness of trade. Those nations are still Islamic today. Aceh, Indonesia. Indonesia is territory that Islam moved into 1,300 years ago. And yet Indonesia is a Muslim nation today. The same with Malaysia. The same with Nigeria, the northern half of Nigeria. The same with Algeria. The same with Morocco. These nations all live according, there's an aspect of Sharia law in all of these countries, and they all identify themselves as Muslim. So the Muslim imperialist enterprise in hammering home the core culture, the single culture of Islam, which, by the way, Islamic scholars say that Islam is not a religion. It is a total system of life. In other words, it's a governmental system, it's a military system, it's a judicial system. It is, and by the way, it's a religion, but it's not like any religion that you and I know in the West. It is a total system, or in other words, a totalitarian system. It is a totalitarian system. And that system is alive in countries that cover a 13,500-mile wide arc across the globe. Nothing of this kind has ever existed. The West, as Christianity, there are remnants of Christianity left in the old Christian lands, but there is a contestation. There are various other ideas, Buddhism, secularism, Darwinism, all kinds of things. By the way, Buddhism, Darwinism, secularism, and all those things are utterly denounced as corrupt, as ungodly, as satanic by ISIS.
Well, but the point I was trying to make is if you look at any online history source or offline, you will find most historians and scholars of empires will list three candidates for the largest empires in history. The British Empire is the largest ever of the 19th century, with the famous saying, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," and then the two largest contiguous land empires, arguably being the USSR at its height, or the Mongol Empire just before Genghis Khan died. And these were supreme rulers. Khan ruled with an iron fist, as did Stalin. But yet, if you look at Islam, and if you want to talk of that as an empire, look at the greatest Islamic killer that I know of, and that was Tamerlane. Tamerlane, the sword of Islam. But Tamerlane killed mostly Muslims, people, and it was a political wars that he fought to conquer, to try to rebuild the Khanates. I mean, he was also infatuated with Genghis Khan. He wanted to be the second coming of Khan more than I think he ever wanted to be the second coming of Muhammad. But when you talk about that, and as I mentioned, you had a lot of warring kingdoms. You even mentioned, for example, the war between Iran and Iraq. So these are states just like France and Germany that were at each other's throats, and they weren't battling necessarily because of Islam. Although I guess you argue that these were countries and peoples that have been at war in one form or another since prehistory.
Well, not exactly. What Muhammad accomplished was he brought a bunch of tribes that, according to Muslim scholars, used war as their hobby, and he brought them together. And the big word in the vocabulary of Islam is one. There is one God, there is one set of laws, there is one everything. And that means one ruler. So in the early days of the Caliphate, there was a single ruler. He was the Caliph. It took a while before these divisions between potential caliphs, or these divisions between political factions, grew up. And the caliph, under one of the early caliphs, a general who had been nicknamed the Bone Crusher, rode off and took all of the upper part of Africa, that is the Mediterranean littoral of Africa, and then took Spain, took all of it, took the whole damn thing. Spain was Muslim for 700 years. And those were the days of the Islamic Empire. At the same time, Islam had moved in the other direction, as I said, all the way to Aceh, Indonesia. It was an unparalleled swath of territory, and it was, for the next 200 years, under the control of one caliph, one leader.
Well, I look it up. I would say most scholars would disagree with you that there have been certainly Islamic empires, but to talk about the empire of Islam is sort of like talking about the communist world when it was really a world that was battle between Red China and the Soviet Union. They were at each other's throats in a sense more than, if you were to ask your typical Soviet citizen of 1965, the year I was born, they would probably have felt that Red China was a greater threat to them than the U.S., I think.
Well, the difficulty here is that we're using a quibble. By this quibble, there's no such thing as a European empire. There never was. Again, because the Europeans were at each other's throats. But that's not true. There was a European imperialism. There was a European imperialism, despite that.
But they were separate empires. The British and the French and the Germans, while they intermarried, they were separate, distinct political entities.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You're right.
Well,
So right,
but
but the
what?
fact is there was a European imperialism anyway, despite all those divisions. So the division doesn't count. The fact is there is an Islamic empire, whether there was a single emperor in power or not. And it was united by Muhammad's form of Islam. It was united by a common religion, except that's not a religion. Remember, it's a total system of life. It's a totalitarian political system. It was united under one homogenizer, and that homogenizer was Islam.
Well, let me get back to the ideas of colonialism and oil. Let me start with colonialism first, since it actually European colonialism, which is often thought of as being a trigger for the radical Islamist ideas today. A couple of months ago, I finally got to see the film "The Battle of Algiers" by Gillo Pontecorvo, and that's considered sort of a primer against colonialism. And one of the things that I saw in that film and argued with some people was that you see there the seeds of the fanaticism of Islam, in that you have colonialism, which European colonialism, which was certainly a terrible system, and you see the snobbery and the bigotry and the racism of the French elites in Algeria. But then the main character, the main Algerian character, is a would-be Shah. There's a scene where he confronts a former friend of his who's a pimp who's running a brothel, and says that he's going to cut off his hands just because he's suddenly been radicalized. Talk to me about your ideas about colonialism, European colonialism, and a lot of people's idea that has been a trigger for the current Islamism.
It's a false. There's something false in all of this, and the falseness is that the very existence of Morocco and Algeria as Muslim states came from Islamic colonialism, came because a master race, the Arabs, came marching out of the Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian deserts, and became the conquering class, became the aristocratic class, became the ruling class in these countries of Berbers and other indigenous groups. And they wiped out the indigenous religions utterly and completely. So we have one colonialist group, the French, battling another colonialist group, the Muslims, for a territory that originally belonged to people like the Berbers. It's two colonialisms against each other.
And the other major point that's often brought up is oil, which we could say just target around the middle of the 19th century. It seemed to me, and again, I'm not a historian of Islam, but if we go to the middle of the 19th century, that seems to be a low ebb in terms of political power for Islam on the world stage, at least, if not in the Middle East and those environments. Then we get the shift from whale oil to petroleum, and it seems to me, just as a layman, that one of the great fuels for the current Islamism is petrodollars, and I think most people recognize that the West, especially the U.S. and China and India and the big countries, if we're going to not have a total meltdown of Antarctica and all the problems that's going to occur with weather, we're going to have to get off the petro addiction. If that happens, doesn't that really undercut the ability of the worst elements of Islam to even fund whatever they want, whatever mayhem they might be planning?
Well, yes, it does. And you're right to point to oil, because oil has led to an awful lot of friction over the course of the last 150 years. But you've got to remember that the Muslim attack on Spain, taking Spain over for 700 years, occurred without a squabble over oil. The Turkenfurcht, which is a phrase that's used in the Muhammad Code, or a word that's used in the Muhammad Code, that's German for the terror of the Turks. The Turks had Europe scared to death, and scared that it was going to be taken over by Islam from 1500, at least 1500 onward. Martin Luther wrote 3 books about Islam because everybody was terrified that Christendom was about to fall. And the Turks had Europe totally on the run, totally terrified for a long, long time, and there was no oil wealth in those days, none whatsoever. So the history of making jihad against the West and against the East goes all the way back to Muhammad himself, who among those 65 military campaigns that he commanded were campaigns against the Romans. By the Romans, he meant the Byzantines, because remember, Byzantium was the new Rome, the new head of the Roman Empire. So it doesn't take oil money to make jihad. Jihad is an eternal obligation until the day of judgment. Every man must get off his ass at some point, stop watching television, and go and make jihad. What is jihad? Jihad is going out and killing unbelievers. And people who die killing unbelievers, you get an express ticket to paradise. And even though there are quibbles about whether there's 72 virgins or not, I've gone very deeply into this. You know, the book has 1,927 endnotes, and many of those endnotes have 5 references. And yes, it is 72 virgins. If you die killing unbelievers, the way that the Berlin truck massacre killer died after killing unbelievers, the way that the San Bernardino killers died killing unbelievers, the way that the Orlando, Florida killer died killing unbelievers, you get an express ticket to paradise. You're a shaheed. You're a martyr. You will be admired. You will be a role model. Other people will follow. You will be one of the highest things you could possibly be in the world of Islam. And none of these things require oil money. They just require tapping the human spirit, which is an incredible fuel source.
Well, it's true that oil was not behind these prior pre-18th century and before conquest. The world does change. I mean, we have information there and all kinds of ignorance, whether it's Islamism or Nazism or any other kind of things. I mean, the internet, for all of its major faults and its addiction to pornography and lowest common denominator, this, that, and the other thing, information, the free flow of information, seems to be, to me, one of the great things that will ultimately work against not only Islam or Islamism, but any kind of future noxious ideology. Do you not think that technology is a potent weapon against Islamism?
Well, it's a potent changer of human life. It is an astonishing changer of human life. It gives us powers that our grandparents would not have believed we could ever possess. And yet the internet is being used with extraordinary success by ISIS as a recruiting tool. It's been used with extraordinary success by Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was named the base because it had a database, because it had a list of people with whom it was in communication, and its list was contained in laptops. When we capture the home of a major jihadist leader, we always capture laptops, hard drives, and USBs. That is USB thumb drives. So Islam has proven to be remarkably resilient in taking advantage of new technologies. And we hope, look, Islam has been around as a political system for close to 1,400 years. Democracy, the system that you and I cherish and without which we couldn't have this conversation, democracy has only been around for 250. Let us hope that democracy proves as enduring as Islam and proves as capable of adapting to new technologies as Islam has proven to be. And let us hope that our self-hatred, which is something that has been inculcated in us for a long, long time now, this belief that only we have been imperialists, no, that's not true. Islam has been the greatest imperialist in the world. That only we are colonialists, no, that's not true. Islam has been the greatest colonialist in the world. That we are responsible for most of the mass murders in the history of humankind. No, there are 4 generals in Islam who were lauded for killing more than 100,000 people each. Lauded, praised for that. In order to survive, we have to understand our flaws and correct them. So we do have to be self-critical, but we can't let our self-criticism destroy us. We also have to recognize the good points in our civilization. You know, we've doubled the human lifespan since 1850. We've added an extra 40 years to it. We have increased the earnings of the poorest paid worker sevenfold. We have increased the average IQ by 35 points. We have increased the factor of peace by a factor of 10. You are 1/10 as likely to die a violent death at the hands of another human living in Western society than you would have been in 1650. And we've added 4 inches to the average human height. We've accomplished astonishing, staggering material miracles, which is what my book, The Genius of the Beast, is in part about. And we have to cherish those things, or Islam, which has very little of the kind of self-doubt, does not allow the kind of self-doubt that we encourage, Islam will take over, or China will take over, or even Russia, which is fighting for ancient Russian values, the values of the Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox Church. They will take over. Our values are better than theirs. Our values have proven to produce more astonishing things than theirs. It's incumbent on us to, yes, criticize ourselves, but believe in ourselves, know our positives. It is a crime not to know your positives, because you are taking a chance on not advancing those positives into the next generation.
Yeah, you anticipated my next point, and that was several years ago. Another controversial book was released by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature, which touched upon some of the things that you talked about, how in the West especially, but even worldwide, human beings have been getting more peaceful on a per capita basis in all recorded history. And somewhat controversially, Pinker makes the claim, and I do agree with him, that the noble savage myth was just that. But we on a per capita basis, you mentioned some of these atrocities committed by terrorists. But if you look at them and compare them to, say, the things that were done by the Nazis or the Kaiser or by the Soviets or by Mao, they pale in comparison, and that's, I think, the thing that I know, having read some criticism of the book online, that it seems that you have the alarms going over something that, as I said, you cannot compare these terrorists to the Nazi war machine of 1939, say, just before it invaded Poland, because they don't. Do you actually believe that they represent as big an existential threat as the Nazis did in 1939?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
And the deal is this: I'm a Jewish atheist Zionist, and I explain how this relates to my 50 years of research now on Islam in the book. And I'm a target for annihilation from the Islamic groups, because Muhammad built anti-Semitism into the very roots of his religion. Now, to date, look what we accomplished in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. Look what we accomplished even before then, when we firebombed 75 Japanese cities, or when we firebombed Dresden and the cities of Germany. We have done some really awful things, and the body counts of modern Islam, of modern jihadism, are infinitesimal. They're the size of a flea compared to these giant mass killings that we have perpetrated. But remember, there are 125 Islamic bombs. That's what the president of Pakistan, under whom those bombs were developed, called them. He did not call them Pakistani bombs. He called them Islamic bombs. And Pakistan is a country where Islamism, jihadism, runs amok, where street crowds of hundreds of thousands can be gathered in the name of jihad. If those weapons ever fall into the hands of any of these jihadists, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki are going to look minor by comparison. There's a reason the kid who pulled off the attempted killings at Ohio State University 3 weeks ago, a kid who tried to drive a vehicle into a crowd of students and kill as many as possible, and jumped out with a knife and tried to kill as many as possible with his knife. That kid was a person you and I would have loved. He was a magna cum laude student at his community college. His fellow students said that he was always the best prepared for class, and he always came with the best questions. we would have loved him. But in his statement, which he issued on Facebook before going out to commit this, what he hoped would be a mass murder, he said that every Muslim is a sleeper cell waiting to be awakened. That's his words, not mine. And he said that he would be willing to kill 1 billion non-Muslims if that's what it took to achieve his aim. 1 billion. Back in 2004, one jihadist leader said we may have to kill as many as 4 million Americans. So we may have to, and ISIS, in one of its recent magazines, talked about using a dirty bomb in Manhattan, a dirty nuclear weapon. If these things come to pass, then the killings that the West has perpetrated in Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these could seem minor by comparison.
Well, let me ask you about probably the closest cognate I can give in, say, the last 100 years, and that would be Japan, because we talk about the Nazis, but the Japanese Imperial Army was far more fanatical. I mean, they had less resources than the Nazis. They lasted longer against the U.S. They were the first to, with the bombers going into the plane. They were the first, the kamikazes, the suicide kind of thing. And people said you couldn't reason with these people. They were like aliens to the Western mindset of the era. But yet, once Japan was conquered and defeated in war, they rather easily assimilated. Do you think that, let's say whether it's by war or by peace, how do you denazify or de-Japanize, if you will, de-Islamify Islamists? Because in my opinion, I don't see them as the existential threat that the Nazis and the Axis, let's say, the Axis represented in 1939. But if we grant you what you seem to be stating, that they are as big an existential threat, and we do defeat them, how do you denazify an Islamist, say?
It's a very good question, because how did we denazify the Nazis, and how did we denazify the Japanese? We did it by conquering them in the way that Muhammad himself said: you should conquer a people, make great slaughter in the land.
Now someone's going to listen to this and say that you're not arguing that preemptive strike.
No, I think that would be horrible. I think that would be monstrous.
Yeah.
I think that would be appalling. I think that's utterly and completely morally unacceptable.
Okay.
So thank you for getting me to clarify that. But how do we denazify them? I was put on the phone. My biggest fan splits this time between Islamabad and Pakistan and Dubai. And I wrote the promotional copy for his business in Dubai because I believe in him. And he said, Pakistan really needs your way of thinking. And he put me on the phone with 3 Pakistanis. One owns a $4 billion, that's billion with a B, business in Pakistan. Another, the poor baby, only has a $750 million business with offices in 17 countries. And the third was the head of Pakistan Software Association during the years in which Pakistan's software industry doubled in size. And I said, you guys are all modernists, you are all pluralists, you are all tolerant, all the best of what humanity can be. But you dare not raise your voice in your own communities. You must have a voice. You must speak out. They know their throats could be slit for speaking their point of view. Just as, Azra Nomani and Ayan Hirsi Ali, their throats weren't slit, but they were certainly suppressed by the Council for American Islamic Relations and the Muslim Student Association. But in Pakistan, it's death to express yourself. And then they said, well, look, before we really start this conversation, let's just apologize. We want to apologize to you for Dubai. We want to apologize for its materialism and its excess and its vanity. And I said, don't you dare apologize for Dubai. The things that you don't dare speak in words are the things that Dubai speaks in another language, the language of architecture. With its architecture, Dubai says that pluralist, modernist Muslims have a right to exist. And you don't dare say that. We need to somehow encourage the voices of people like Ayan Hirsi Ali. We can't be conned by the bullshit that says that Ayan Hirsi Ali is an Islamophobe. She's a person who comes out of the Muslim community. How dare we say that? We cannot allow people like Asra Nomani to be shut down. She was also shut down by the Muslim Student Association when she was supposed to speak at Duke University, and her speaking engagement was canceled. Then, when it was finally reinstated, she only got 9 people in the audience because everybody had been convinced that she's some kind of a racist. No, she comes out of a Muslim background. She wants a Muslim woman to be able to walk into a mosque and pray the same way that men can pray in a mosque. That's the outrage for which she is being punished. We have to speak up for our friends who are Muslim moderates. We can't allow a person like Hussein Abish to say there is no such thing as a moderate Muslim. No, there is a distinct difference between a tolerant, modernist, pluralist Muslim and a jihadist. It is not all the same. Hussein, you are wrong. We have to do our best to speak on behalf of our Muslim friends. One day, in 2000, I had put together my first website, and I was getting my website counter told me I was getting hits from the United Arab Emirates and from Saudi Arabia. And at that point, I was on the punishment list in 17 Islamic countries. So my shrink came over, my shrink who is Muslim. And I said to him, why am I getting these hits from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia? Is it because they're checking up to see where I am so they can punish me? He said, no, Bloom, listen up. You have to understand something. There are universities in the United Arab Emirates. There are universities in Saudi Arabia. There are professors who are never able to speak their minds, and you are speaking for them. But it is not enough for us non-Muslims to speak. We somehow have to create an environment in which our tolerant, pluralist, modernist Muslim friends can speak vigorously and express their points of view and legitimize them.
Well, do you think that it's going to take, say, a Gandhi-like figure or a Martin Luther King-like figure, or even to get a little bit more belligerent, even a Martin Luther, not King, Martin Luther type figure to arise in Islam?
Yes. And it's going to take his ability to outlive his initial statements, to live beyond the day after he makes his initial statements. It's going to take his or her ability to rise above the Muslim Student Association and CARE and the other groups that are really extremist groups pretending to be moderates. And it's going to take that ability to live, which only exists in the United States. Ayan Hirsi Ali does not live in Holland, where she was voted into parliament anymore. She had to flee, because even in Europe, she's in danger of being killed. It's only the United States where these people can survive making strong statements about the right of Muslims to be modernists and pluralists.
Let me talk a little bit about the future then, since the book deals significantly with the past, including the life of Muhammad as you portray it. You mentioned a handful of I guess you would call hegemons of the future, being Islam being one, I believe India, China, Russia, and the West, what we might jokingly call Mick World. For me, when I look at things, I don't think human beings are all that different. I grew up in New York, not far from where you're currently speaking to me. I grew up with people of all different colors, different religions and whatnot. And when that latest, we're just recording a day after Christmas, when that latest Christmas thing came out, whatever it might have been, Beanie Babies or whatever the hell they called it, all those little children, they all wanted the same thing. There's the human desire for acquisitiveness, whether it's knowledge or things, and that can be bad consumerism. But do you think that that eventually, as I said, there are these educated people in the Islamic world. Surely they are going to want better for themselves than to live in constant fear.
Yes, I agree with you, but just so far the fear has predominated. The real hope and the real curse lies in education. If Walid Shubat is a man who says that he was raised in a terrorist family and that he tried to destroy a Jewish bank when he was young, and then he rejected his jihadism, and he now lives in the United States someplace. And Walid Shubat and another person with whom he was interviewed on a Philadelphia television show both said that Muslim children are raised with jihadism. They are raised to hate Jews and Christians. In other words, their education is an education that gives them the history of Muhammad that's in this book, Muhammad the Killer, basically. And that's what you're educated to when you're 3 years old, 4 years old, and 5 years old. Stick with you for the rest of your life. So the real answer, in part, is in taking a close look at the Muslim educational system worldwide, including in the United States, and to get rid of the hatred and get rid of the calls for mass violence that are in elementary school textbooks and junior high textbooks and high school textbooks.
Yeah. Let me just play devil's advocate for a moment, because one of the criticisms that fundamentalism, and not only just Muslim fundamentalists, but fundamentalist Christians and even fundamentalist Jews make about Western society seems to me to be valid, and that's the sort of moral zombie-like life where people just stagger around wanting things, you know, as in the George Romero films, people as zombies just wanting things. And I'm not religious. I think you've said many times you're not religious. But I would have to admit that when I meet a religious person of any persuasion, a truly religious person, they seem to have an idealism that your typical nihilist moral zombie doesn't. Do you think that there is any good in the criticism brought by Islam or Islamism against the West that has some merit?
Well, I've been reading the latest edition of Rumiyah. Rumiyah is the ISIS magazine. And it talks about the fact that you have to go through a million trials to accomplish your dreams, to accomplish something of significance. That you have to go through many, many extremely painful experiences, and you have to endure those experiences with tremendous patience and never lose sight of your long-term goals. And eventually, if you do that, you will reach your long-term goals. It's something to the equivalent of one of the lines in there is, you have to be tried in the fire in order to be a glistening sword, or something like that. And I agree with all of that. And I found it stirring. And I found it resonated with my own philosophy about life. And here it is in a magazine that's instructing you on how to kill me and how to kill you, on how to find us alone walking in the park and kill us, on how to find us coming out of a bar inebriated and kill us, on how to find us in a moment of isolation when we think we're on a quiet walk and kill us. But it had valid things to say about how to lead your life. It had valid things to say about patience, endurance, and the value of difficulties, that every difficulty can be turned into an opportunity in the long run.
You're also
so the answer is yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're also not only a man who's a political beast, but you're also someone who's very interested in science and technology. And let me just
I like this science.
Yeah.
Science is my life.
Well, let me just give another sort of existential threat of the day, and if you can, weigh them. People like Ray Kurzweil and people who talk about the singularity and artificial intelligence. I think even Stephen Hawking, the noted astrophysicist, has said that the gravest threat, in their view, to modern man and women is not Islamism or not China or Taiwan or whatever things bubble up here, but it's actual artificial intelligence. In your own personal opinion, do you view that or Islamism and terrorism as a graver threat, as some people would call the robo-apocalypse kind of a scenario?
Absolutely. And here's why. Because Islam is a philosophy. Islam is a philosophy. Whoops, hang on. I forgot to turn off the sound on my phone.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go.
Go ahead.
No, and I haven't turned off the sound yet. Because Islam is something that endures beyond all technological changes. It is a philosophy. It is a total system of life. It has endured for nearly 1,400 years. It will endure in all probability for the next at least 400 years. It will rise above a temporary idea, like Ray Kurzweil's idea. Remember, Ray Kurzweil's idea was that the singularity would arrive in 2005. Well, if my count is correct, It's going to be 2017 any minute now. And the singularity, yes, the singularity has arrived over and over again. We are not the same humans we were in the days of the Civil War, not by any stretch of the imagination. You and I could talk to a person 13,000 miles away while we're walking down the street in the afternoon. And when we're finished, we can turn on our music. That was impossible just 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And yet, human nature has this remarkable resilience. It's as if it has its own built-in gyroscopic mechanism. And it always imagines itself to be the same, no matter how incredible these changes are. So Plato, who didn't have access to any of the things we take for granted, not laptops, not cell phones, not recorded music, none of these things. When we read him, we recognize him. He seems like he could be our neighbor. He certainly seems like he could be our contemporary. So what Ray Kurzweil is talking about is a great flip in our consciousness of ourselves, thanks to technology. But that flip never occurs. It never happens, despite the fact that the technology changes in massive ways over the course of time. On the other hand, a philosophy like Islam can endure the way that philosophy behind our founding fathers, that all men are created equal, with an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That has endured for 250 years. Islam has endured for 1,400 years. Plato has endured for 2,400 years. And the philosophies that will continue to guide our lives in a more powerful way than the technologies. The philosophies will change our consciousness. The philosophies will give us the lens through which we see. And one of the deepest problems with Islam is Muhammad's example as a killer and a conqueror, a person who enjoyed beheadings. That has to disappear the way that the Old Testament genocide has disappeared from our vocabulary. And that's the goal with an Ashraf Mamani and an Ayan Ali Hirsi and a Martin Luther for Islam, is to get Islam beyond its violent phase.
Yeah. Let me just ask a final question in this segment, and then we'll wrap things up in the final segment. And I'll let you give your closing remarks. History, a lot of people think of history as the ebb and flow of almost inevitable determinism, things that are going to happen one way or the other. And you can point to some instances of that, because if you remove Darwin, there's always a guy like Wallace behind him. On the other hand, there's the great man theory of history, where there's someone like a Genghis Khan, who you mentioned in the book, who just wrenches history in a different direction, changing the course of the Mississippi almost. And that brings up the law of unintended consequences, because I was thinking, as reading the book, I'm a big, I've always had an interest in Khan and the Mongol Empire. I think they are woefully underrated. Back in 1999, when all those millennial lists were coming, and most of these historians left Genghis Khan off the list of the most important people of the last 1,000 years, I was like, are you kidding me? But there were two battles, or two instances in the Mongol conquest that seemed to me to have been crucial. One is when Genghis Khan himself died just as the Mongols were about to enter Poland and Hungary and whatnot, and sweep through Europe. And then I believe it was his successor, Ogadai, when he died, the Mongols were pressing up against the Mamelukes. I believe it was Ogadai, I could be wrong, but one of the Khans, and then he died. And in both instances, the Mongols retreated, saving Europe, saving Islam. But if those two deaths hadn't occurred at that time, this might all be academic. There might not, Christianity might be a Nordic cult, and Islam might be, just left with the Sufis or something. Do you foresee any kind of bubbling up of anything outside of Islam, and we'll talk about Islam in the last segment again, but outside of Islam that could be a counterweight for the peoples that live in Islamic society?
It's back to Ashraf Mamani and Ayan Hirsi Ali. They're being marginalized. They're being marginalized in the West because we're all trying to be politically correct and non-Islamic phobic, and so we're swallowing the line that these two women are Islamophobics, when in fact they come from a Muslim background, and that's silly. But it's from people like these that things are going to happen, and you can never predict, because no one would have ever predicted, you and I would not have predicted in 600 AD that Muhammad would ever amount to anything in his own lifetime, much less 1,400 years later. He was an orphan. His father had died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6 years old. He was left with an uncle who at one point was so poor that he couldn't feed his own sons. He literally could not feed his own sons. And he had to go shopping them around, trying to find somebody who would take in his sons and foster parent them. This is not a promising beginning for a prophet. The people of Mecca at first laughed at him, but later on, they tried to kill him. He fled to 280 miles to a town of less than 1,000 people. How in the world could this man ever have an influence on Mecca, much less on the history of the next 1,400 years? We couldn't have predicted it. We simply couldn't have predicted it. So let us hope that a champion of modern liberal democracy, who is able to preach the values and the accomplishments and the future of modern democracy, is able to come along, not just one to save the West, but another one to take Islam into the future in a peaceful way.
All right, well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll give you a chance to wrap up your thoughts, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been interviewing Howard Bloom about his latest book called The Muhammad Code, and we've talked about the history and future of Islam and the world in general, its impact, good, bad, or indifferent. We were ending talking about the hope for a reformation in Islam. What do you hope that your book specifically can accomplish to further that end?
It's a very good question. It's pinning the bell on the cat. Jihadism is an incredibly dangerous belief system. It is a belief system that revels in mass murder, absolutely revels, it celebrates mass murder. And Islam itself is the biggest empire in the history of the world and the biggest colonialist force in the history of the world. If you don't understand the story of Muhammad, if you don't understand the story of Muhammad as a military commander, if you don't understand the history of Muhammad as a man who reveled in genocide, you don't understand what's going on in the world today. Because headlines, every 3 months there's going to be another headline about another atrocity. If we're lucky, maybe it's only once a year. And you won't understand where those atrocities are coming from unless you understand the story of this aspect, which was the primary aspect for 8 years of Muhammad's life.
Well, let me just follow up on that one thing. It seems to me, and I made this observation just a few years after 9/11, that most of the people in the U.S. sort of were horrified for a couple of years, and then at the 5th anniversary, they're like, oh, yes, yes, and then by the 10th anniversary, it almost became pro forma to just say, oh, 9/11 was terrible, but I've got to go get my Big Mac or whatever. Do you think, and this goes back to what I said earlier about the low numbers, and an interesting statistic that you can look up on the CIA fact book or any other website like that is that more people worldwide die in industrial and job-related accidents than they do in all the wars combined, and that's been from 1946 on, the last 70 years. Do you think that it's going to take something like a dirty bomb, something like a poisoning of a reservoir with some Zika virus or something, that's going to wipe out 1.5 million people in LA or in London or in Moscow? God help us if it's Moscow, the way with the Putin there. But do you think it's going to take some atrocity on that level to wake people up? Because people seem to get along and say, oh, 3 people died here, 17 died in that car bomb, someone bombed the Boston Marathon, etc., etc. Do you think it's going to take a big catalyzing event in the West?
Well, a big catalyzing event in the West would certainly change the way we all look at everything. And it's most likely to happen in New York, where I'm sitting right now. It's most likely to affect me. But the fact is that on the left left is closing its eyes to what Islam really is and fooling itself. And my friends on the left, my community, must read this book, or they don't understand the world they're living in. They don't understand the forces of history. They don't understand what human accomplishment can achieve. Because this is one of the most chilling, but also one of the most astonishing stories, literally, in the history of the world. But on the right, if you watch Fox News or you listen to Donald Trump, the threat of ISIS is exaggerated. It is overemphasized. The ideal is that the left will wake up, read this book or something like it, and realize that there is another historic force that has also been monstrous in the world. And if we're going to stop monstrous things from happening, we have to know that force as well as we know our own society. And on the right, I just hope that this book doesn't take our eyes off China, take our eyes off needing to be competitive, take our eyes off needing to be ahead of everybody in technology and job creation and the reinvention of what jobs are and the reinvention of productivity. Those are the things we need to concentrate on, the positive things. But you can't concentrate on the positives without looking down at the potholes you're about to step into. You can't be like Thales. Let me give you just the story of Thales. Thales had come from Egypt. His head was filled with Egyptian mathematical possibilities. He was walking across the landscape at night, looking up at the sky, looking up at the stars, thinking about all the stuff he got from Egypt, and he fell into a pothole because he wasn't looking at the ground beneath his feet. In order to get to the stars, we have to look at the ground beneath our feet as well. And this is the ground beneath our feet, the Muhammad Code.
I was never a fan of Trump throughout his career, nor of Hillary Clinton. I voted third party for. I voted that before, but this year I also voted third party as well. But yet I've seen a few recent videos of yours where you've been a bit more solicitous and favorable towards Trump's egoistic, but yet somehow more brutally blunt way of dealing with things. Do you think that, at least in the short term of the next 4 years, assuming that Trump serves out his term, that Trump might actually, in some perverse way, be better in terms, at least, of handling Islamism than Hillary Clinton would have been?
The fact is that Barack Obama has been driving ISIS back into the hole from which it came. He has been driving ISIS out of Mosul. He's on the verge of beginning to drive ISIS out of Raqqa, which is its headquarters, its capital. And he's done through patience, perseverance, and not going for headlines. He's probably accomplished more than Donald Trump will ever accomplish with his crude techniques. But the one thing I realized that made me do a relatively pro-Trump video, because I've been hammering Trump, he stands for everything I loathe. His moral principles, his principles toward women are absolutely nauseating. They're incredibly bad, just astonishingly bad. But how did he win the election? He won the election not on the popular vote. Hillary won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. He won it by understanding what the game really is, and the game really is the Electoral College, going crazy, going to states that the press just thought were insane during the last weeks of the campaign, and hitting the states he needed to get the Electoral College vote, not to get the popular vote, to get the Electoral College vote. So on a gut level, a visceral level, he seemed to understand the underlying reality of this game far better than Hillary Clinton did.
Yeah.
And we are in a set of games. We are playing games with the Chinese. We are playing games with the Russians. We are playing games with ISIS. Yeah. And if at a visceral level he understands these games far better than Hillary would have, then maybe, just maybe, this man who represents every moral value I loathe may produce something of value for us.
Well, howardbloom.net is Howard's website. I'll link to it below this video. Also, his YouTube channel to watch some of the videos that I just alluded to. And Howard, as usual, whether someone agrees or disagrees with you, it's always entertaining and informing. So thank you for talking about your book, The Muhammad Code.
And Dan, it's been a pleasure having you in my life for the last 10 or 12 years. Just a pleasure.